All right, today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment. You've probably heard this word before. If you think of Enlightenment, it might make you think of a bunch of different ideas. It might make you think like, achieving inner peace, nirvana, some kind of Zen practice, Eastern religions. But the word Enlightenment in the context that we're going to use it is talking about a period really in the 16 and 1700s where Western Europeans began to rethink how we know knowledge. Philosophers will often use this term epistemology. A way to interpret that word is to think of it as a science of knowledge or a theory of how we know what we know. I know that seems a little confusing or opaque in some way, but I really want us to think about this as a big shift in how people think they know truth. We've seen that during the Renaissance, people began to go back to original sources, go back to Plato, Aristotle, go back to classical Greco-Roman ways of thinking, that eventually that gave us a method of going back to texts, right? This inspired many of the reformers to go back to the Greek and Hebrew and the scriptures, interpret the Christian scriptures into the common people and give them that. And then with the Enlightenment, we see another shift that begins to happen. People begin to say, well, how do we know truth? How do we know what we know? Historically, Western Europeans have pointed to Christianity for over 1,500, 2,000 years, right, as the foundation of truth. When the Enlightenment, we begin to see different methodologies. It's not that Reformation way of if you want to know truth, you go to the Christian scriptures. Necessarily, we will find Enlightenment thinkers who justify their belief in the Christian scriptures, but the foundation of that knowledge is not just because the Bible tells you so. Enlightenment thinkers are going to appropriate two major ways of how to figure out knowledge. One is empiricism and one is rationalism. Oftentimes these will be used simultaneously together, and sometimes we'll see that they're in tension. So empiricism, very simply stated, is that you can only know truth through the five senses that comes to you. So if you can't taste, touch, smell, see, hear it, you can't know that it's true. You can see where there is going to be probably some issues there when it comes to running traditional Christianity through that test of truth. A very classical example of this is John Locke, who wrote essays concerning human understanding. He becomes an English figure of the Enlightenment, going to be very pivotal, not just in a theory of knowledge, but also in the theory of government as we begin to move towards the revolution. Locke is essentially going to say that people come into this world a blank slate. And the only thing that ends up making them who they are is this series of experiences that they come through their senses that create their memories. So you can see the implications here are you can only know truth that can be repeated, right? You figure out natural laws through reproducing what will eventually become the scientific method. And the idea is also here is you can see that everyone comes into the world the same. So this empirical theory of knowledge is very important because it's going to rule off certain things as being unverifiable or unknowable or untrue. Simultaneously, it's going to put the idea that all people come into the world equal. So we can see how both of those might have some serious implications when it comes to religion and or government. Another method of approach that people will implement during the Enlightenment is this term rationalism. The idea here is that you can also know truth through rational thinking, that there's something innately inside people that orders the world in a certain way, that if the law of non-contradiction, for instance, something can't be both something and not something at the same time. And so a lot of Enlightenment thinkers will say rationalism is a proper mode of truth. The famous philosopher Descartes is a good example of this. He does these meditations in the 1600s where he essentially sits in the room and he goes, I'm going to deny or doubt everything that I can possibly doubt to get the very foundation of truth. And he goes through all of these exercises and basically says, I can't even believe empiricism because, people's eyes get bad as they get older. You lose touch with your senses. How do you know when you're awake and dreaming? He even goes down as far as to say, even the things that I see could be projected by an evil demon on me. I can't know that, right? And so very famously, he's going to come to the conclusion, the only thing that I can know is I think, and I know that I am, because there is a thinking thing. Very famous line, I think, therefore I am. So that is a very Enlightenment way of approaching how do you know knowledge. And then he'll go back, try to build up on top of that foundational truth. So empiricism, the idea that truth comes through the senses. Rationalism, the idea that truth comes through rational thinking or deductive logic through argumentation. Very central. Another really essential part of this Enlightenment project is the idea of progress, or the idea of the ability of an optimism for human nature. Remember, this is very different than, say, John Wittrop's vision of everything is ordered, everything is predestined by God because of the fall of sin that we see in the world, right? That man is fundamentally broken, and there has to be some kind of grace from the Christian God to rebirth him spiritually. Enlightenment thinkers are going to begin to question things like that, right? And they're going to say that if everyone comes in as a blank slate, then if they are taught right, given a good education, good home life, a good, raised properly, then they will become virtuous citizens. They can be good people. And so this is really a break, not just with how we know knowledge, but what is human nature. And these are going to have very long-lasting implications on many of the thinkers that become fundamental to the creation of the nation. They're also going to push back severely on traditional notions of religion. So we've seen John Withrop, we've seen the centrality of the Christian faith to the Puritan community. And during this Enlightenment, we're going to have thinkers that begin to reassess and reevaluate Christianity. The famous founding father and later controversial writer Thomas Paine, after he writes Common Sense, which we'll read an excerpt from, he is going to write Age of Reason, which also becomes a substitution name for the Enlightenment, this Age of Reason. And he's going to say, whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness for which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more constant that we would call it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that served to corrupt and brutalize mankind, and for my part, I sincerely detest anything. I detest it as I detest anything cruel. So Thomas Paine, who will be a very influential person as we begin to move towards the revolution, his coming out and that speaking against traditional Christianity will eventually lose him many, many friends as we go past the revolution. Not everyone will be that critical, though. There are other people that will try to use ideas from the Enlightenment, empiricism, and rationalism to justify religious belief. A really good example of this is William Paley. He's the British philosopher, theologian, who essentially says, look, we can use empiricism, we can use rationalism in order to get to the Christian God. And he's going to very famously put forth this watchmaker hypothesis, where he says, look, if you're walking through the woods and you see a watch laying on the ground, you can pick it up and you can see how intricate it is, right? How detailed, and anything that's that intricate doesn't just happen, that it has to be designed. And so you can infer that there is a designer from this. And so what this gets you is it's using empiricism, your senses, right, to look out at the world and say the world is very intricate and detailed, and even if we look at our bodies, there, our hands are made for grasping, or at least they seem to be, right? It seems to be that our eyes were made to see, and so in having that design, they had to have a designer, and so there has to be a first cause of some sort that put everything in motion, knowing that it would lead to this outcome, a designer of some sort. You can see that this doesn't necessarily lead you to belief in Christianity necessarily, right? You might be able to say, well, through rational means, we can see the intricacy of nature using Enlightenment thinking, and we might come to the belief in God, perhaps. But that doesn't necessarily get you to people are raised from the dead, or Jesus is the Son of God, or there is a hell or a heaven, right? You can see how there's these criticisms that begin to emerge of traditional thinking. And these are going to influence very heavily some foundational American thinkers, specifically Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, people that are very foundational in laying the groundwork of the founding generation. Benjamin Franklin's a really good example of this. Franklin is raised in Massachusetts early on. He ends up fleeing a kind of an indentured apprentice relationship to his brother, learning how to print. He goes to Philadelphia. He becomes insanely successful in a printing business. He creates the Penn Gazette in 1728. Poor Richard's Almanac is this kind of catch-all production where he'll put in stories about poor people working really hard until they succeed and become wealthy with astrological articles. It's kind of just almost like a New Yorker kind of thing for the time, like a mixture of little everything that's popular at the time for people. And he becomes really wealthy. and eventually can retire early and becomes a foundational thinker. But during this time, he is a writer, entrepreneur. He's a scientist, right? We think of him as the electricity with the kite, right? He creates many different things, tons of patents where he's doing all these. He's what we call a Renaissance man. And Franklin's very interesting in the sense that he is going to begin to absorb, even though he comes from a Puritan heritage, he's going to begin to absorb Enlightenment approaches. And he's going to eventually say that he is pulled under this notion of deism, or and his interpretation of that. This is a word you might hear. Thomas Jefferson was a deist, or these founding fathers were influenced by deism. Historically, what people have taken that to mean is that they believe that there is a God who created the world and left it in motion, and that he doesn't involve himself with that creation on a daily basis, or he doesn't break the laws of nature. So if there are no people who get raised from the dead, there are not floods that come to wipe out wicked mankind. There perhaps wasn't, the plagues in the Bible, all of these supernatural things. That God doesn't necessarily break the laws of nature to become involved with that creation, but he set it in motion, knowing what it would become. There's still maybe an idea of providence. There's still virtue. There still might be morals that are baked into that. And so what we have is a more scientific approach to belief in God that emerges out of that. And I think Franklin's a really good example because, he'll be critical of some traditional ideas, the deity of Jesus Christ, things that typically are thought of core principles of Christianity, yet you'll see him praying at times, or you might see him advocating for God's will or of some sort. So it becomes very nuanced and complicated. But what I want us to think about that is how Enlightenment thinking, empiricism, rationality, both of these things can come in and create a third thing in tandem with religion that becomes very foundational to many of our founding fathers.